Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, I am joined by journalist and music and film producer Rob SCHWARTZ. Rob is the editor of his dad MORRIE SCHWARTZ book on aging. Rob has produced several projects internationally, so we're going to be talking to him about his music and film career and about his dad's book. So Rob, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Why don't you start off by telling everybody?
Oh, you cut out there. Everything all right? Did we lose a connection?
Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Rob SCHWARTZ, and in relation to what I'm doing now, I edited and wrote some essays for a book that my father wrote in 1988 to 1992. My father is MORRIE SCHWARTZ, who's the subject of the bestseller Tuesdays with Morrie. A lot of people probably know it. There was also a film, and a lot the play is performed around the country and around the world. And personally, as you said in the introduction, I produce music and film. I'm an entrepreneur and a journalist. We can get into more to what I do as well if you're interested.
Absolutely. But for those who don't know, explain to everybody, who is your father, MORRIE SCHWARTZ?
Sure. My father was a professor of sociology here in Boston at Brandeis University, and he was a really sweet, loving individual. He was very, very popular with his students. And then in 1993, he developed ALS, which is a horrible disease. Maybe some of your listeners know it affects your nervous system. You basically lose control of all of your limbs and your body, and it eventually kills you, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease because of the famous athlete who had it. And he started talking about what it was like to be living with this fatal illness and what was important in life and values and how best to live. And he started to get a lot of media attention. He appeared on Nightline, which was probably the leading news magazine TV show at that time. And it was a huge success. Not only was it a huge success, but one of his old students, Mitch Albom, saw the program and decided to come back and talk to my dad, and met with him every week, every Tuesday. And from those meetings, he produced a book called Tuesdays with Morrie, which initially was a very small release, but it turned into a gigantic bestseller. It stayed on the New York Times bestseller list as #1 for 5 consecutive years. It's absolutely crazy. It's one of the best-selling books of the last, 30 or 40 years. And it also spawned a movie and a play with Mitch wrote, which is performed all around the country and all around the world. So it was really kind of a cultural touchstone for a while. I mean, it appeared in all kinds of crazy places. The Simpsons movie references Tuesdays with Morrie, and just all over the place. But it is a long time ago for people, maybe some of your younger listeners, so they might not know it. I do know that some high schools do actually still make students read it. So I guess maybe some young people will know it.
So what made you decide to publish this book now?
Right. So the story is that I was living in Japan for a very long time. Even when my father was ill, I was coming back and forth. But after he passed, I was still living in Japan, but I would come back and visit my mother in the house that my father had lived in, and his study was there just as he had it when he was alive. And I would write my pieces, my newspaper magazine pieces at his desk. And one day I just opened the desk drawer. This is back in the early 2000s, and I found this manuscript. And I remember that I had talked to my father about this manuscript while he was working on it. So, of course, I was super excited to look at it again. And I think the ideas in it are extremely valuable and really, really prescient for the times that we live in now. And I think we have a lot of mental health issues. A lot of people suffering from loneliness. The Surgeon General just came out with a report on like the loneliness epidemic. I think they're labeling it. So I think this book addresses a lot of those issues. It's called The Wisdom of Morrie, and he really talks about, as you age in life, how to remain creative and joyful and engaged, and the old image of elderly people who can't do anything. My father feels that's just so wrong. And elderly people have so much ability and so much knowledge, and it can also, as he writes, can be sort of the greatest time in your life. So I think it's really relevant to today's.
So talk about some of the top 5 secrets that your dad talked about in this book to living a happy and long life.
Sure. I would say actually there's sort of two aspects to the book. As you say, there are like 5 specific things that he lays out that you can do. But before that, I would say the way you should look at this book is it sort of has 2 sides, because my father was a social psychologist, and he was a therapist as well as a professor. So he was really concerned with people's psychological states. And when he started to age, he realized that not only did our society sort of not value elderly people, but elderly people had internalized this horrible ageist attitude that elderly people are just not valuable and should just go away and die. And he thought that this was so wrong and so poisonous, and that he realized that he himself had internalized this terrible attitude, and he needed to get rid of it inside himself first before he could move forward and lead the creative and joyous life. So that's the first part. There's sort of a psychological insight that we need to get rid of these ideas that certain people, for whatever reason, are less than other people. All of these ideas that have plagued our society, whether they're ageist or racist or sexist or ableist. We need to get rid of all those ideas and realize that every person has special qualities and special abilities, and really bring something to the table that nobody else brings, because all of our experiences are completely unique. So that's sort of one of the things that my father talks about in the book. And then to explain the 5 things that you alluded to, my father offers practical tips on how to lead your life sort of creatively and joyfully. And one of the first things he talks about, he thinks that is sort of undervalued or forgotten, especially by elderly people, is laughter. He says it's so important to laugh and to enjoy yourself. So, pursue what makes you laugh, what amuses you, what you find humorous, and, indulge in that and laugh. He thinks it's so important to do that. And I think it's one of the things that sort of we kind of forget in this society, and certainly elderly people, sometimes it escapes their lives. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing, my father thought it was really important that, we all have worries and things that are upsetting to us and things that we feel are not perfectly the way we'd like to be. So it's important to calm your mind and relax and be able to concentrate. And so my father thought that meditation was extremely important, not connected to any religion or anything like that, but just meditate. And there's many, many different ways to meditate. And he did, breath meditation, but his meditation is just concentrate on your breath, calm your mind, realize that, everything is okay. There's nothing to worry about. Try and just remain in that meditative state. And he increased his meditation practice a lot when he got ill towards the end of his life. So that's the second one. Then the third one is that he suggested that elderly people sometimes sort of separate themselves from society. And this is a really, really, negative thing. He thinks they should become more involved in society. And one of the ways to do that is to create a new interest. Find what's interesting to you and pursue it, whether it's, some things that you can read in books or some things that you can learn from other people or what have you. So figure out what interests you and pursue those things, especially if they're new things that you've never thought about before. So that's a really important one. And that one relates to one of the further insights, which is that when you create a new interest, you can make connections with people who have similar interests. We know that it's easy to make friendships and connections with people who you share interests with. You can discuss the interest, look at new angles at it, learn new things that they know about it that you don't know. So creating an interest also will offer you a new world and new people that you can become friends with. So he thought creating and maintaining and strengthening your human relationships was super important. That elderly people tend to be shunted off, that they stop their relationships, or they don't pursue new relationships. They sort of stay at home alone. And he thought that this was really negative. You should strengthen all the relationships you have, whether they're your family, your friends, your professional acquaintances, what have you, and relate to people as strongly as you can. And the last one is sort of more vague, maybe not vague, but everybody approaches it in a different way. And that was that he felt it is important to develop some kind of spiritual connection in the world, whatever that means to you, whether it's an established religion or it's some, feeling that you have that nobody's ever described, or something that's not an established religion, but is more, been developed by another person and something that you can relate to. Whatever spirituality means to you, my father thought it was important that you develop that in later life. So those are pretty much the 5 things that he was talking about. I can talk about any one of them in particular more detail, and my father goes into a lot of detail in the book about how to do it, and giving examples of elderly people who are doing these sort of things, and etc. But those are the 5 basic things.
Well, what you can talk about is how your father described the process of living and creating, and living and aging creatively.
Sure. Well, I think that that's what I've been talking about. He definitely thought it was important to be actively engaged in life, whatever that means to you. And there's plenty of examples in the book. So whether that means meeting your friends and engaging with them, or engaging with social movements or things that you find important, things that represent your values, engaging with those, or as I said, creating a new interest and engaging with that, engaging with groups that already exist, or in fact, even creating your own group. My father, when he was ill, was really, and this is kind of how he got the attention to start with, was really interested in talking to other people and hearing their experiences and sharing his experiences. So he started 2 or 3 discussion groups. One was on politics, one was on death, and it attracted a lot of people. Of course, death is kind of a taboo subject in our culture, and my father addressed that a lot. That was a lot more of the focus of Tuesdays with Morrie, because, of course, my father had a fatal illness. He was dying. So he talked a lot about death. In this book, The Wisdom of Morrie, it's actually written, it's kind of ironic because it's just being published now, but it was actually written before Tuesdays with Morrie, because, in fact, my father wasn't even around when Tuesdays with Morrie came out. He had already passed away. But this book was written before Tuesdays with Morrie, so it's more about life and engaging with it, as you asked me, and making connections with other people and that sort of thing. It's called The Wisdom of Morrie, by the way. So I think that this book is really about that, is really about engaging with life in those 5 things that I pointed out. And it's a book that has a lot of stories and poetry and examples of things that you can do in it. It's not, a book that you necessarily start from the beginning and read like a novel and then put it down. The way that I suggest people to read the book is, have post-its post by. And when you're reading something that's thought-provoking to you, put a post-it on it and you can continue reading, but go back to it and think about the ideas that my father's putting forth. Because there's a lot of stuff where he gives examples and stories and this kind of thing that it's worth pondering. Let's put it that way.
Talk about what it was like editing your dad's work.
Right. Yeah, it was very special for me. So just to put it back in the chronology for a second. So I discovered this book in the early 2000s. My father had already been gone for 7 or 8 or 9 years. So yeah, it was really special for me to find the book again because as I mentioned, I had talked to him about it while he was writing it back in the early 90s, let's say. I was much younger then, but I had an idea of what he was trying to convey, and it was so wonderful to read his words, and I could hear his voice ringing in my ears as I read it, and to remember how engaged and vibrant he was while he was alive. One of the things that was sort of interesting about Dad is that he was a professor, so he was always around younger people, and he never really considered himself as like an aging person until he was forced to retire from the university, right? It doesn't exist today, but back in his day, when you hit a certain age, they were just like that's it. You have to retire. You have to stop being a full professor. And of course, he wasn't very happy about that, but he realized that the world viewed him as an elderly or an aging person, even though he didn't view himself that way. And that relates to what I explained earlier about how he realized that there was these ageist attitudes in the world that were really quite poisonous. So it was an evolution for him to realize how he was viewed in the world and think about that. And that's how he wrote this book. So it really brought it back to me while I was reading the book, his journey from being, sort of a happy-go-lucky, very much beloved professor to somebody who realized that he was, considered an aging person, and then writing about it and describing ways to live your life in that when you're looked at that way and when you are in that stage of life, let's say, because as he points out in the book, for a lot of aging people, you don't necessarily have to go to a job every day. So you have a lot of free time on your hands. So you have the ability to use that free time creatively and joyously. If you just sit around and moan about the fact that this doesn't, you lost this job or, people aren't doing this for you, then you won't be happy. But if you take it into your own hands and go like, okay, this is the situation I'm in now, and this is what I'm going to do with it, then you can really create a vibrant and joyous life. So that was really very, very clear and powerful for me editing the book. And I have to say, since you specifically asked about editing, my dad was a great speaker, a great talker. He would have loved all the attention, by the way, that he gets now, even though he's not with us in body. But he wasn't that concise in his writing. So I did have to do a lot of editing and consider like, okay, what are the core ideas here? And, that's the job of an editor. And it did take a lot of work to get to a place now where I think it's very readable, very easily readable, and everyone can relate to what's in the book.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of your work. Tell us how you got in the film and music
Sure.
producing, and also you have a
Sure.
music festival coming here.
Yes,
So tell
that's
us about
right.
all of that.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, that's right. Well, my story is kind of strange. So I'll start at the beginning. I moved to Japan. Well, I went to Asia when I was in my 20s, and I did a big trip around Asia. And that's when I came back to the US after that and met my father, stayed in the house for a couple of months and talked to him about the book. And after that, I moved back to Japan. So I had lived in Japan when I left in 2020, almost 30 years. And in Japan, I decided I wanted to be a journalist. I started writing about music and film. I founded a couple of record labels, mainly to bring it was mainly, not exclusively, but mainly to bring music, international music, into Japan, American and British music. I did a lot of sort of electro rock crossover, and the first label was actually a reggae and breakbeats label. We even released a new album from the legendary duo Sly and Robbie from Jamaica, who people may know. They were the drum and bass for Peter Tosh and Grace Jones, and a lot of stuff going back. So I did the record label. Well, I did two record labels for a long time. And I'm also, my main field or original field as a journalist was actually film, and I studied some film in school. So after writing about film for a long time, I decided I wanted to produce film. So I have four feature films. The two that are most easily accessible in this country are, one is called Putty Hill. It was released in 2010 by a fantastic, fantastic director. And his next film, actually, he played at Sundance, the Sundance Film Festival. And Putty Hill is about teenagers in the Baltimore area. People in that area will recognize the name Putty Hill. Putty Hill is a neighborhood in Baltimore, and it's about their reaction when one of their friends commits suicide. So it's pretty serious, but he uses a lot of experimental techniques, and I think it's just a brilliant film. I really like that film and would encourage people to watch it. It's available on the different services. And then the other film that I've done pretty recently is called Bernard and Huey. And this is a very interesting story because it was from a scriptwriter and cartoonist named Jules Feiffer, who was extremely famous in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. He did cartoons for The New Yorker and The Village Voice, and he had these two characters, Bernard and Huey. And this screenplay is based on these two characters. He also wrote the screenplay for a very famous film. It came out, I think, in 69, or maybe a little later than that, called Carnal Knowledge, which had Jack Nicholson in it and Art Garfunkel, and was a huge hit at the time. He wrote the screenplay for that. It's considered quite an incisive look at relationships and changing relationships. He also wrote the screenplay for Popeye, which was considered a monumental failure, but it was a very big Hollywood release. So he wrote a lot of screenplays, and this was an unproduced screenplay that he had written in the 80s. So my team and I found the screenplay, got it, contacted Jules Feiffer, got the rights, updated it because he had written it in the late 80s, and we updated it to the 2000s. And it's this great sort of buddy comedy about two guys who were friends in college and haven't seen each other for a long time, Bernard and Huey, and one of them turns up at the other's apartment. And in college, one of them was the suave ladies' man and the other one was kind of the loser. And it's funny because when they meet like 25 years later, they've kind of switched positions. The guy who's the loser was very successful, and the suave ladies' man is kind of broke and, doesn't have anything going on. But as they hang out, they slowly slide back to their original sort of positions. So it's quite clever and quite funny at the same time. That's available on all the streaming services. The director, named Dan Mervish, has made a lot of indie films. He's also a co-founder of the Slam Dance Film Festival, if people know that. And his recent film, which is called 18 and a Half, is the next film after Bernard and Huey. Is getting a lot of press and a lot of great reviews. So he's a great director, and I would encourage people to check out both those films, Bernard and Huey and 18 and a Half, which is actually about the Watergate era. If people from that time period will remember, there was 18 and a half minutes missing from a tape that was found. Nixon had been taping people in the White House, secretly taping conversations. In any case, those are the two films that I would recommend here. And yeah, let me talk a little bit about the music festival that I'm involved with. It's called One Topia. It's founded by a brilliant musical artist named Evan Clausen and a producer in LA called Simon Bogdanovich. and Bogdanowicz. I better get his name right, Bogdanowicz. And we are creating a music festival as a benefit for mental health because we really believe there's a mental health crisis in this country. And we're creating a foundation also called One Topia to distribute the money to mental health groups all around the country. The festival is slated for next year, 2024. I think it will take place in LA. We have a lot of powerful people in the music industry on the board, and I'm really excited. We're really moving forward very fast. So people can check that out. We have a website. It's onetopia.com, onetopia.com. And all the information's up there. Once we have artists booked and that sort of thing, we will certainly release that information. And as I said, all of the money is going to charity. This is going to be 100% of the net profits is going to go. None of us are getting paid to do this. We're doing it because we believe that mental health really needs to be focused on in this country. And of course, it relates to my father's profession and his life purpose, which was very much concerned with mental health. In the essays in this book, Wisdom of Morrie, I write about my father and the mental health field. My father wrote a very important book on mental health in the 50s called The Mental Hospital that was so monumental. It was used as a textbook for decades and decades for psychologists. And my father co-founded a low-cost mental health collective in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Greenhouse, where they treated people no matter their ability to pay, because they felt like it was ridiculous that only people who, had a lot of money could get psychological care. So this is back in the days when not everybody went to a psychologist, unlike today, like back in the 70s. And it was a sliding scale. If you didn't have any money, you didn't have to pay anything. And it was very, very successful. Greenhouse, beloved in the community. So in some ways, I feel like I'm continuing my dad's work, both with this book, which is obviously written by him, and One Topia Benefit Music Festival, where all the money is going to go to mental health charities. So, and mental health organizations that are trying to help people and raise awareness about mental health. And I'll mention one other thing, which I'm doing because I have a bunch of projects. I'm also involved in a virtual reality online concert creation platform, which is called Mosh Pit. And we're a little startup, but we have some fantastic graphics. We have some fantastic coding, and it really looks, the concert and the environments really look fantastic. I would put them up against any other, platform doing this. And if you know anything about that, there are some really large platforms doing what we're doing. Fortnite and all of these guys, multi-billion-dollar corporations. We're a little startup, but I think our thing looks fantastic. We're probably going to launch in June, I think. And that's moshpit.live, moshpit.live. And we'll be launching that online concert creation platform. And we're really gearing that towards like everybody. If you want to put a concert up there, it doesn't matter if you're a famous band or a touring band or not. So it's going to hopefully be like, the people's platform. It doesn't have to be Lil Nas or somebody like that to do. In these days, the only people that have done real VR concerts are people with a huge amount of money, massive stars. But we want to kind of open it up to everybody. So those are 3 projects that I'm involved with. And of course, right now, the Wisdom of Morrie is my main focus. I really want to get the message out there. Just to let people know, we do have a website for the book, The Wisdom of Morrie. It's wisdomofmorrie.com with the WISDOMOFMORRIE, wisdomofmorrie.com. And all the information on the book and clips of me and stuff like that are up there. And clips of my dad are up there too.
Okay, well, that answers one of my questions about any current upcoming projects that you're working on that people need to know about. So you also been covering Asia for Billboard magazine since 2007. So tell us about that and what you write about and how you got into it.
Sure. Well, as I described before, I went to Japan. I became a journalist. I started the record labels. And because of that, obviously, I became very knowledgeable about the music industry in Japan. So as I was writing for other magazines, the opportunity came along to write for Billboard. And as people in the music industry know, or even on the sides of the music industry know, Billboard is it's the magazine of record for the music industry in this country and pretty much the world. I mean, there are a few other things out there. And of course, there's things in other languages. But in terms of the English language, Billboard is pretty much reporting on the music industry in the most important way. So I was really happy to write for them. That's right. I started in 2007. I think in 2008, I became pretty much the only correspondent in Japan. And then I became pretty much the only correspondent in Asia, not the only correspondent, but the only regular full-time correspondent. And I became a bureau chief of sorts, reporting from all over Asia and editing other people's works. So I'm pretty familiar with the music industries of all of Asia. And to me, that's pretty fascinating. Of course, when you say that to people today, they're just immediately going to think of Korea and K-pop because it's so dominant. And fair enough. And I can talk about that for a long time. I was reporting on it before they got to the number one, hit album status that they have now, BTS or Blackpink, what have you. But Japan is a fascinating music industry because very few people know, even in the music industry, few people know that Japan is the number 2 music market in the world in terms of revenue by far. I mean, they're well above number 3, which is Germany. Most people think it's going to be China or something like that. And while China has grown a lot, particularly in the time that I was reporting, it's still not near the same revenue as Japan. So Japan has a huge revenue in music industry, yet their music industry is very self-contained. What's hugely popular in Japan is generally not popular anywhere else. I mean, if you look at the top 10 hits from every country in the world, they will resemble each other. Some of them will be different. Korea these days would be, exclusively Korean pretty much. But most of the top 10 of all the countries in the world would be, relatively similar, have a lot of crossover. Not so in Japan. If there was one song in the top 10 in Japan that was in a top 10 chart in some other country, that would be a lot, right? Japanese are very focused on Japanese music. They have a genre of Japanese music called J-pop, which is sung in Japanese, produced by Japanese. They're the way, because of the Japanese language, the way that they sing and the rhythms of the music is quite unique. And it hasn't really caught on outside of Japan, though a few bands have tried. And they have every other genre, of course, of music in Japan, J-rock, and they're pretty much into everything, which is pretty crazy. I mean, they have a country scene in Japan and a reggae scene in Japan, but it's all Japanese artists. They have had a lot of focus on international music, and there's that old cliche, big in Japan. But that was really in like the 70s and the 80s. Nowadays, the Japanese music industry revenue is about 90% domestic artists, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. I mean, that is an incredible percentage. So I reported on the Japanese music industry and also the rest of Asia, Southeast Asia. I reported a lot on China because the music industry grew very quickly from like 2010 to 2020, let's say, up to the pandemic. And that's a whole nother scene. If you're interested, I could tell you about it because of the government they have in China and the economy. They didn't have a lot of homegrown stars from the mainland of China. All of their music stars were from Hong Kong and Taiwan previously, but that all changed between 2010 and 2020. And now in China, in the mainland, their top 10 hits are going to be mainly domestic artists and not artists from Hong Kong and Taiwan, which, are not, they're still Chinese territories, but they're not the mainland. The mainland is a very specific, system and economy and the rest of it. So that pretty much covers it. If you have any questions about Asian music industry or my reporting for Billboard, I'd be happy to answer them. It's something I did, as you said, for 15 years. So, I mean, I still do it nominally, but I'm not living in Asia right now. So it's hard to report on it.
Okay, well, throw out your websites again so that way people can keep up with what you're up to and all of your reporting on the Asian music industry.
Right. Most of my reporting on the Asian music industry is on Billboard. Some of them are behind a paywall and some of them are not. But if you type my name into Billboard, they have a search engine. You could find, 100 articles that I wrote. You may have to be, a subscriber to Billboard. I'm not sure. But yeah, the only website that I have right now, and maybe this is a mistake of mine, that's really active, that's my website, is wisdomofmorrie.com for this book. Of course, we have websites for the virtual concert creation platform, Moshpit, moshpit.live. And as I said, we have a great website for the music festival that's going to happen next year, One Topia. That's onetopia.com. But in terms of the reporting that I did in Asia, I should get that up, but I don't have a personal website with that stuff up yet. Like I said, you can find it on Billboard, and actually, you can find a lot of stuff on me on the internet if you're interested on YouTube, because I appeared in a lot of music conferences around Asia. There's a very famous music conference in Asia called Music Matters. It's held in Singapore. It's the main, most important music conference in Asia. And every year I moderate or present or something. So there's a lot of video of me at Music Matters. I also used to appear a lot at the major tech conference in the world, which is called Web Summit, is held in Lisbon, Portugal. And this is a very, very well-known tech conference. Major, entrepreneurs and stuff announce their projects there. And there's a bunch of video up on YouTube, or maybe even through their Web Summit site. I think it's websummit.com, but I'm not sure, of me presenting or moderating. I presented on Moshpit, the VR concert creation platform, at Web Summit, I think 21, I think that was, yeah, 2021. So those links are all up there, but unfortunately, I don't have my own website where they're all put in one place. I should try and do that.
Okay, well, you already answered the question about the current and upcoming projects, so close us out with some final thoughts. Maybe something I forgot to touch on that you would like to talk about, or just any final thoughts you have for the listeners.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm releasing this book now, The Wisdom of Morrie, by my dad, and I do think it's really relevant to our society that we have now in the United States, both in terms of elderly people need to be more included, need to be more honored like they are in some Asian societies, and more paid attention to, because elderly people have a lot of wisdom, right? They've lived through a lot of stuff that we haven't seen. And then when you experience a lot of things, you learn from it, right? So I think that we need to value our elderly people like they do in other societies. And this book can also help elderly people and all people live their lives more creatively, more joyously. And I think that that's really important. And finally, we live in the society that's so divided. And in the end, it's like we're all human beings. We all share the same experiences, and we need to relate to what connects us as opposed to what divides us. We need to stop harping on our divisions in this society and bring people together, right? And this is something that my father talks a lot about in this book, The Wisdom of Morrie. He wants us to, what he calls, stay human, which means concentrate on what it means to be human, because that's the experiences we all have, making connections with friends, loving your family, et cetera, all the things that you enjoy in life. And that's the same for all people. So whether you have a difference of opinion on this subject or that, topic, is not something that we should be concentrating on. Of course, it's fine to discuss those things, but remember that we all share the same human experience. We're all part of the same human family. And indeed, we should treat each other as family. There's really no reason to be so negative towards somebody just because they have a different opinion than you have, right? So I think that that's what my father would emphasize if he were here today.
Absolutely, ladies and gentlemen. So be sure to check out Rob's work, pick up this book, go to
Right.
Wisdom
The
of
Wisdom of
Morrie.
Morrie. Wisdom of Morrie.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
definitely check it out. And also, if you have any guests or suggestion topics, cjackson102@cox.net is the place to send them. Thank you for listening. And Rob, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much.
For more information on the Living the Dream podcast, visit www.djcurveball.com. Until next time, stay focused on living the dream.